The sentence Americans don't like hearing. There was a time when the American dream wasn't a debate. It wasn't political. It wasn't theoretical. It wasn't controversial. It was simple. You worked, you earned, you built a life. And most people believed quietly, confidently, that if they followed the rules, the future would take care of itself. That belief is fading. Not loudly, not all at once, but steadily. And what's disappearing isn't just money. It's certainty. The uncomfortable question. Here's the question no one likes asking. What happens when a promise that held a country together starts slipping out of reach? Not because people stopped trying, but because the ground beneath them moved. Why this feels personal. If you're listening to this, you probably weren't lazy. You probably didn't quit early. You didn't ignore responsibility. You showed up. And yet, something doesn't feel right. Progress feels slower. Stability feels fragile. Milestones feel delayed or unreachable. And the hardest part? You can't always explain why. The dream was never about luxury. Contrary to what some believe, the American dream was never about mansions. It was about predictability. A belief that effort today would lead to security tomorrow. A sense that if you made sacrifices early, life would get easier later. That pattern built trust, and trust built patience. What's changed is an attitude. People still want to work. They still want stability. They still want to build something meaningful. What's changed is confidence, that the system will meet them halfway. And when confidence disappears, behavior changes. The quiet realization. For many Americans, the realization didn't come during a crisis. It came during normal life. Paying bills, looking at rent, thinking about kids, planning retirement. That's when the thought appeared. Even if I do everything right, this still feels impossible. What the American dream actually was. The American dream wasn't guaranteed success. It was upward movement. You didn't expect perfection. You expected progress. One generation did slightly better than the last. Kids had more opportunity than parents. Effort translated into options. That pattern held for decades. The foundation, stability. Home ownership wasn't easy, but it was attainable. Education wasn't cheap, but it paid off. Work was demanding, but it led somewhere. The math made sense. And when the math makes sense, people stay invested. Why belief matters more than reality. Even when times were hard, belief carried people forward. Because belief creates patience. Patience creates endurance. And endurance builds societies. When the equation began to shift, the change didn't happen overnight. That's why it's so hard to pinpoint. Costs rose gradually. Wages adjusted slowly. Expectations stayed the same. Until one day, the gap became visible. What the American dream actually was. The American dream wasn't guaranteed success. It was upward movement. You didn't expect perfection. You expected progress. One generation did slightly better than the last. Kids had more opportunity than parents. Effort translated into options. That pattern held for decades. The foundation, stability. Home ownership wasn't easy, but it was attainable. Education wasn't cheap, but it paid off. Work was demanding, but it led somewhere. The math made sense. And when the math makes sense, people stay invested. Why belief matters more than reality. Even when times were hard, belief carried people forward. Because belief creates patience. Patience creates endurance. And endurance builds societies. When the equation began to shift, the change didn't happen overnight. That's why it's so hard to pinpoint. Costs rose gradually. Wages adjusted slowly. Expectations stayed the same. Until one day, the gap became visible. Not the myth, the reality. When people talk about the American dream, it often sounds exaggerated. White picket fences, one-income households, carefree prosperity. That's not what most Americans actually lived. The real American dream was quieter, more practical. It wasn't about getting rich. It was about getting ahead without falling behind. Work was hard, but it led somewhere. Jobs weren't easy. They were physical, repetitive, demanding, but they were connected to progress. You knew what staying meant. You knew what leaving meant. There was a visible path. Start here, learn this, earn more later. That clarity mattered. Why clarity builds loyalty. When people understand the rules, they're willing to play the game. Even if the game is tough, uncertainty is what breaks trust. And for a long time, the rules were clear enough. Home ownership, not easy, but possible. Buying a home wasn't effortless. It required saving, sacrifice, time, but it wasn't abstract. People could imagine it. They could plan for it. And when people can plan, they can endure. The numbers made sense. Income aligned with cost. Not perfectly, but reasonably. A raise mattered. Overtime mattered. Staying loyal mattered. Progress was incremental, but visible. That visibility is what created hope, not a guarantee, a trade. Education wasn't sold as magic. It was sold as leverage. You invest time. You take on effort. You gain access. And for many decades, that trade worked. Not for everyone, but for enough people to keep belief alive. Why promises matter more than perfection. No system works for everyone, but systems survive. As long as people believe their effort will be rewarded eventually, that belief powered generations, so slowly nobody called it out. The shift didn't come with alarms, it arrived quietly. Costs crept up, raises slowed, benefits shrank. None of it felt dramatic alone. That's why people adapted instead of resisting. Adaptation is a double-edged sword. Americans are good at adapting. Too good. They work longer, take on more responsibility, delay rest. Adaptation kept things moving, but it also masked the problem, a gap that grew invisible. Over time, effort increased faster than reward, but because the change was gradual, it felt personal. People blamed themselves. I should do more. I should be better. I should sacrifice longer. And so they did. XY self-blame was natural, because the old rules taught them to believe, if it's not working, I'm the problem. That belief used to be empowering. Now it's exhausting. Generational confusion. Why conversations started breaking down. Older generations looked back and said, it worked for us. Younger generations looked forward and said, it doesn't add up. Both were telling the truth, but they were talking about different systems. Same effort, different outcome. The effort didn't disappear. The return did. And when effort stops delivering results, frustration replaces motivation. The cost of basic life, housing, healthcare, education, transportation. These aren't luxuries, they're requirements. When requirements consume most of your energy, dreams get postponed, and postponed dreams eventually disappear. Why this feels like failure even when it's not? People measure themselves against expectations they inherited. Expectations formed in a different era. When reality doesn't match those expectations, it feels like personal failure, even when it isn't. The moment confusion turned into doubt. For many Americans, there was a moment, not a collapse. A question, is this still leading somewhere? That question is dangerous, because once it appears, it doesn't go away. Why motivation started to change? Motivation used to come from progress, now it comes from survival. That shift changes priorities. It changes risk tolerance. It changes timelines. It changes dreams. The dream didn't die, it lost its map. The destination still exists, but the path is unclear. And without a map, people hesitate to move, not because they're lazy, but because wrong moves are costly. The emotional cost nobody measures. Stress became normal. Delay became standard. Uncertainty became background noise, and people adapted. Again, how normal became heavy. The most dangerous changes don't announce themselves. They arrive quietly. They feel manageable, temporary, explainable, and because they don't feel urgent, they don't get challenged. Small adjustments, big consequences. At first, people made small changes. They delayed buying a home. They postponed starting a family. They worked a little more. Each decision felt reasonable, responsible, even. Why no one panicked? Because nothing broke all at once. Paychecks still arrived. Jobs still existed. Life still functioned. But the margin disappeared. And margin is what turns effort into comfort. The rise of almost stable. People weren't failing. They were surviving. Bills were paid. Savings were thin. Progress slowed. This became the new normal. Not poverty. Not prosperity. Just pressure. Why almost is exhausting? Almost stable means constant vigilance. No room for mistakes. No buffer for emergencies. No confidence in the future. That mental weight accumulates because they had to. Warning signs didn't look dramatic. They looked practical. Credit cards for emergencies. Side hustles for security. Longer hours for safety. Each solution masked the underlying problem. Why people chose coping over confrontation. Confrontation requires energy, and energy was already being spent just to stay afloat. So people coped, and coping became culture, and there was less of it. When money tightened, time disappeared. More hours worked, less rest taken, fewer chances to recover. Life sped up without moving forward. Why burnout felt personal? Burnout didn't feel systemic. It felt individual. I can't keep up. I must be doing something wrong. People internalized pressure instead of questioning structure. Where opportunity became expensive, opportunity concentrated in fewer places. Those places became costly. To chase opportunity, people paid more. Rent, commute, stress. The dream required more sacrifice just to stay competitive. Why leaving wasn't easy. Leaving meant losing access, jobs, networks, momentum. So people stayed, even when it hurt. Dreams put on hold. Family decisions became financial equations. Can we afford kids? Can we afford childcare? Can we afford time off? These weren't philosophical questions. They They were survival ones. Why delay turned into doubt? Delays were meant to be temporary, but temporary became permanent, and permanent uncertainty changes how people see the future. Even when people tried harder, effort increased, rewards didn't. Raises lagged behind costs. Promotions felt rare. Security felt fragile. The connection between work and life weakened. Why? Motivation shifted. People stopped asking, how do I get ahead? They started asking, how do I not fall behind? That shift changes everything. The moment people stopped dreaming out loud, dreams became private, careful, guarded, because hope without evidence felt risky, and disappointment was expensive. Why? Silence replaced confidence. When dreams feel unrealistic, people stop sharing them. Silence spread. Not anger, not protest, just quiet resignation. The generation caught in between. Some people remembered how it used to feel. Others only knew how it feels now. That gap created misunderstanding, not resentment. Confusion. Why? Conversations broke down. Everyone was tired, and tired people struggle to explain complex problems, especially when those problems feel invisible. When adaptation stopped working, adaptation has limits. When people realize that working harder doesn't change outcomes, something breaks, not dramatically, internally. This is where belief began to fade. Belief isn't lost in one moment, it erodes, and once it's gone, effort feels hollow. When the weight finally shows, when systems change slowly, the damage doesn't appear all at once. It shows up in people, in their posture, in their patience, in their plans. Stress became the background noise. Stress used to signal danger. Now it's constant. People wake up tired, go to sleep worried, carry pressure everywhere, not because of one crisis, but because there's no margin. The most confusing kind. Many Americans aren't broke, but they don't feel secure. Bills are paid, savings are thin, emergencies feel threatening. This kind of pressure is disorienting. Why? Security matters more than income. Income looks good on paper. Security feels good in life. And when security disappears, anxiety fills the space. The emotional cost of doing everything right. People followed the rules. They went to school. They worked hard. They avoided unnecessary risks. And yet, the reward feels smaller than promised. That disconnect creates quiet anger, not rage. Disappointment. Why? Disappointment is dangerous. Anger explodes. Disappointment erodes. It eats motivation slowly. When life becomes a calculation, stress doesn't stay at work. It follows people home. Decisions become transactional. Can we afford this? Is this worth the risk? What if something goes wrong? Love becomes careful. Why? Connection suffers first. When survival takes priority, connection feels optional. But the loss of connection makes survival harder. Instead of stability, home used to represent safety. Now it represents stress. Rent increases. Mortgages feel intimidating. Moving feels risky. The place meant to ground people keeps them on edge. Why? Roots matter. Stability allows people to plan. Without roots, everything feels temporary. Even life itself. When there's never enough, more work, more responsibility, less rest, time became scarce. And without time, reflection disappears. Why? Busy isn't productive. Busy looks like effort, but it drains creativity. And without creativity, progress stalls. From purpose to obligation. Work once offered meaning. Now it offers necessity. People show up because they have to, not because it leads somewhere. Why? This feels so deeply personal. Work is tied to identity. When work feels empty, people feel invisible. Carried quietly. Planning, budgeting, risk assessment. These never stop, and they're rarely acknowledged. The mental load is constant. Why? This leads to emotional fatigue. The brain never rests, and exhausted minds lose optimism. From expectation to exception. Hope used to be default. Now it feels conditional. Maybe if nothing goes wrong. Maybe if I get lucky. That's not a dream. That's a gamble. Why? People stopped believing in fairness. When outcomes feel random, effort feels meaningless. And meaning is what keeps people going. The silent question nobody wants to ask out loud. Is this really as good as it gets? Not because life is bad, but because it feels capped. That question lingers. Why? This is a turning point. Societies rely on belief. When belief fades, participation changes. Quietly, not lazy, not entitled, just cornered. Feeling trapped doesn't come from failure. It comes from limited movement. From realizing that every direction carries risk, and very few lead forward. That's the feeling many Americans live with now. The illusion of choice. On paper, there are choices everywhere. Different jobs, different cities, different lifestyles. But in reality, many of those choices aren't viable. They're theoretical. Moving costs money. Changing careers costs time. Taking risks costs stability. And stability is already fragile, emotionally and financially. In the past, people could recover from mistakes. Now mistakes linger. A wrong move can set someone back years. That knowledge makes people cautious. Not because they lack ambition, but because the consequences are heavier. Why? Risk feels different now. Risk used to be part of progress. Now it feels like a gamble. When the safety net thins, boldness disappears. Waiting for later that never comes. Many Americans are waiting. Waiting to buy a home. Waiting to have kids. Waiting to feel secure. Waiting for the moment when life finally begins. But waiting too long changes people. Why delay turns into resignation? At first, waiting feels strategic. Later, it feels permanent. And permanent waiting drains hope. The internet effect. People didn't just feel behind. They saw it. Online success stories, highlight reels, curated lives. Even when they know it's selective, the comparison still lands. Why comparison hits harder now? Because expectations haven't adjusted. People still measure themselves against a version of success that no longer reflects reality. I did everything right. This is the sentence heard quietly everywhere. I did what I was supposed to do. And it's usually true. Education, work, responsibility. When effort doesn't match outcome, people question themselves. Why self-doubt replaced confidence? Because the system stopped giving feedback. Hard work no longer guarantees progress, so people internalize the gap. The feeling of being stuck in place. People aren't moving backward. They're not moving forward either. They're hovering, and hovering is exhausting. Why stagnation is more painful than failure? Failure has direction. Stagnation doesn't. It drains purpose, even when they look good. Titles sound impressive. Paychecks look acceptable, but growth feels capped. People sense ceilings everywhere. That awareness changes motivation. Why people stopped chasing more? Because more feels abstract. Security feels urgent. Family pressure without family security. People want connection. They want roots, but roots require stability, and stability feels out of reach. Why this feels like a loss, not a choice? People didn't reject the dream. They postponed it, and postponement slowly turned into grief. The unnamed grief. Mourning a future that was expected. This is rarely discussed, but it's real. People aren't just tired, they're grieving a version of life they assumed would arrive. Why this grief is hard to express? Because nothing visibly went wrong. There's no single event to blame, just an absence, not wealth, confidence. The American dream was built on belief. Belief in progress, belief in fairness, belief in effort. When belief fades, the dream weakens. Why this matters more than money? Money can be rebuilt. Belief is harder to restore, not defeat, adjust. Many Americans haven't given up. They've adjusted expectations, smaller goals, lower risks, shorter horizons. That adjustment is rational, but it changes the future. It was never just about money. When people say the American dream is disappearing, they often think about wealth, but money was never the core. The dream was about direction, knowing that life moved forward. If you showed up and tried, that sense of direction is fading. Predictability is gone. Life used to feel navigable. You could map it, graduate, work, save, build. Now the map feels outdated, not useless, but unreliable. And uncertainty changes behavior. Why predictability matters? Predictability creates patience. Patience allows sacrifice. Without predictability, people hesitate to invest. In careers, families, futures, stability, not success, is fading. Success was never guaranteed. Stability felt attainable. A steady life, manageable stress, a future that made sense. Now stability feels fragile. Why fragility is exhausting? When life feels breakable, every decision feels heavy. People live cautiously, not because they lack courage, but because the cost of failure is higher. Time horizons have shortened. People plan months ahead, not decades, because long-term planning feels risky. The future feels conditional. Why this changes a society? Long-term thinking builds nations. Short-term survival sustains individuals. When a society shifts toward survival mode, its dreams shrink, not destroyed, damaged. Trust in institutions, trust in systems, trust in outcomes, not gone, but shaken. And shaken trust takes time to rebuild. Why distrust creates withdrawal? When trust weakens, people disengage. They do the minimum required. They stop imagining bigger futures. Quietly, unevenly. The American dream isn't gone everywhere. It still exists, in pockets, in places where costs align with wages, in communities with support, in moments of opportunity. But it's no longer universal. Why this matters? A dream that only works for some feels like luck, not promise, and luck doesn't inspire effort. The shift from promise to probability. The dream used to feel promised, now it feels possible, but uncertain. Probability replaced assurance. That changes expectations. Why this feels like loss? Because expectations were inherited, and losing inherited expectations feels like betrayal, even if no one intended it. The silent adjustment continues. People are adapting. Smaller dreams, shorter plans, lower risk tolerance. This adaptation is rational, but it reshapes the future. Why adaptation isn't the end? Adaptation motivation keeps people going, but it doesn't restore belief. Something more is needed. The question nobody has answered yet. Can a dream survive? Without predictability, can effort matter? Without assurance, the answer isn't clear. And that uncertainty defines this moment. Why this moment matters now? Because belief hasn't vanished. It's waiting for evidence. What remains when the noise fades? There's a temptation, at the end of conversations like this, to offer solutions, to wrap everything in optimism, to promise a comeback, to say everything will work out. But that wouldn't be honest, because honesty is what's missing right now. The American dream was never a guarantee. It was a belief, a shared understanding, an agreement between effort and outcome. That agreement weakened, not because people failed, but because the conditions changed. What people are really feeling. Not anger, not rebellion, confusion, a quiet question that surfaces late at night. Did I misunderstand how this was supposed to work? That question is heavier than rage. The most difficult truth. The dream didn't disappear. It narrowed. And when something narrows, more people are left standing outside. Why this is hard to accept? Because generations were raised on expectation. Expectation of progress. Expectation of stability. Expectation of reward. Losing expectation feels like losing ground. Even if nothing visibly collapsed, what still holds people together? Despite everything, people still show up. They still work. They still care. They still hope quietly. That matters. Why quiet hope is different? It's cautious, measured, less about dreams, more about survival with dignity. A different kind of dream may be forming. Not larger, not louder, smaller, more realistic, more local. People are redefining success. Stability over status, time over things, peace over promises. This isn't defeat. It's adjustment. And adjustment is human. But adjustment alone doesn't rebuild belief. The question that remains: what kind of future does a country build when its dream becomes conditional? There's no clear answer yet. And maybe that's okay. Why uncertainty isn't the end. Uncertainty forces reflection. Reflection precedes change, but only if it's acknowledged.